Hello and welcome back to the channel. As always, I'm your host, Morgan. Today, we're going to be talking about a study that actually looked at the effects that pesticides have not on critters like honeybees and runoff into the water, but the soil and the organisms that live within that soil. Before we really jump into the topic though, please remember to like, comment, subscribe if you feel so inclined and you would like more of this science-y educational content coming to you on a mostly regular basis. Now, let's get into this. The first thing we need to do is kind of summarize the study and what they did here before we can really get into the nitty-gritty of the conclusions they made and all that fun stuff. The first thing that we need to understand about the study is it's what is known as a literature review. And what literature reviews do is they compile a whole lot of other studies and a whole lot of other formal works together and draw some conclusions by looking at those studies. And so this literature review primarily looked at studies that looked into the effects of pesticides specifically on the soil. And again, this review was looking at pesticides and the soil because most other studies, at least in recent times, have been focusing on pollution via runoff into waterways or air pollution. So the researchers that compiled all these studies together and did this literature review really wanted to get an idea of what's going on with the soil, since we already know that this nutrient pollution from fertilizers and things like that running into waterways can create these algal blooms that can deplete oxygen in the water and create other nasty effects, ultimately either greatly harming that aquatic ecosystem or even killing it for a period of time. And then also different fertilizers, the chemicals can actually end up in the air. It can pollute the air and create cascading effects that way. So within the soil, since this study focused on the effects on the soil, there's a few things that we need to keep in mind here. Is that it's not necessarily just the dirt. The soil also contains quite a few organisms, both micro and macro. Micro meaning the little microscopic organisms that you can't necessarily see with your naked eye, and macro meaning the bigger organisms that you can see with your naked eye, like earthworms, for instance. And these organisms play roles in nutrient cycling. A lot of them are going to be decomposers. They're going to break down the dead stuff that's in the soil. And please remember, dead stuff is going to be both plant and animal matter. And they're going to play parts in nitrogen fixing. They're going to play parts in that carbon cycle. So they're a big deal. A lot of these organisms also play a part in the regulation of pests and diseases, since there are viruses that are going to affect not only the organisms in the soil, but also the crops and the things that are planted there, or whatever agriculture happens to be going on in that area and any ecosystems nearby. And organisms like the earthworms actually play a massive role in maintaining that soil structure, keeping it aerated and keeping it healthy so that it can continue to be used for agriculture or whatever. And most pesticides are going to be applied directly to the soil in some way. Now, I do realize that there are pesticides that are sprayed from the air, but the vast majority of them tend to be granular or something of that matter, at least according to this study and what they've looked at. And what we really know before this study going into it is that invertebrates like honeybees have been very negatively impacted by pesticides, since pesticides don't necessarily only kill the target organism. So we get pollinators like the honeybee and like butterflies and things like that being negatively impacted by the use of these pesticides. But the problem here is that if honeybees are the main substitute for testing how pesticides affect other creatures, you're kind of ignoring all of those soil organisms, because honeybees can represent the pollinators and the terrestrial invertebrates, but they can't actually represent accurately what's going on below the surface of that soil. So what exactly did they look at now that we've explained some things and why they wanted to look into this? Well, they looked at about 400-ish studies. I think the actual number was 394, but don't quote me on that one. I do have the study link down below if you want to dig through that and find the exact number. And within these 400-ish studies, there were 275 unique species looked at and over 2,800 tested parameters. So tested parameters are just things that were tested. We're not going to get into the specifics of all that in this video. They do break it down more in the study, and if you are interested, I do encourage you to go read it. Know that it is a bit technical and long. There's also another article about the study that I've linked down below too that's a little bit easier to digest. And then once they compiled all this information, what they ultimately found was that 70.5% of those tested parameters showed negative effects on those little communities of organisms in the soil and on the soil itself. And again, the other massive theme that they noticed is that these organisms living in the soil are often overlooked in these testing experiments, since even in the studies that they were looking at, the main emphasis would be on those invertebrates like the honeybees. So what exactly is the big deal? Why do these results matter? Why is this literature review a big deal? Well, again, the main thing here that is probably the biggest takeaway for anyone that's not going to be discussing this at length is that pesticides harm more than just the target species. And again, we've already seen this in studies that have looked at butterflies, studies that have looked at bees. We already know that pesticides kind of kill indiscriminately. They don't only affect that one thing that you're trying to target, because that's just kind of how poisons are. And pesticides ultimately are poisons. And the other big takeaways here is that there are environmental impacts that are not being accurately looked at, specifically the soil. There's still some question marks as to how long these negative impacts on the soil and the organisms in the soil will last if pesticides are to stop being used, as in how long do these negative things that the pesticides do stick around? What is going to be the lasting impact? Ultimately, question mark, but it is likely to be a long-term effect. And if we're losing those soil micro and macroorganisms, we're ultimately depleting the soil itself. And the soil is the base of ecosystems and those organisms that help keep the soil healthy and help keep the primary producers, so the plants that live in the soil that provide the base of the food web, really do help keep that ecosystem healthy. And ultimately, without them, ecosystems may or may not be able to survive. The thing is that we have a lot of question marks, a lot of we don't knows when it comes to what are the big implications of using a lot of these pesticides that have been deemed safe by the Environmental Protection Agency and other agencies around the world. And the thing with those agencies is that they primarily look at how something's going to impact human health ultimately, because I've said it before, humans are a fairly narcissistic species, and we tend to see ourselves as removed from the ecosystem, removed from the environment, and that is not a good way to look at things, because anything we do does impact the ecosystem, impacts the environment, and ultimately is going to come back to impact ourselves. There are also these questions of, okay, how far out around these agricultural areas are these negative impacts from the pesticides we use? And again, it's very obvious if we have like pollinator species in decline, then that's clearly going to cascade as well through the ecosystem, because the plants that rely on these insects to pollinate are not going to be as successful because they're not getting the pollination they should be getting. But what about in the soil? Well, the thing is, we don't really know. So it seems like a question of, oh, well, it's just the soil that's being used for that field of wheat is going to be degraded, but everything else will be fine, so it's not a big deal. Well, we don't know. And remember that pesticides are chemicals, and chemicals aren't necessarily going to stay exactly where you put them. It is entirely possible that they're going to diffuse throughout. You have to remember that there's rain, that they can possibly get on other organisms that are going to carry them elsewhere. Chemicals aren't as easy to contain as just an animal that can be thrown in a pen. So there's these bigger implications that I think are important to look at, and I think that while it's not realistic to say that we need to move away from pesticides entirely, and I completely understand that, and I'm not advocating for that, but I would advocate, and I do advocate, for the fact that our agricultural practices, or at least what they are in the modern era as of the time I'm making this video, are not sustainable, and our massive usage of pesticides is one of the main reasons it's not sustainable. And this brings us back to the question of, would it be better to just use these genetically modified organisms that have these genes for pest resistance? Would it be better to use that as opposed to putting chemicals down on the ground? Personally, I'm of the camp that says that these GMOs are not the worst thing in the world. And I do think that the media has massively overhyped how bad they are, but they do need to be taken on a case-by-case basis. And that is completely reasonable, but I don't think that we should just shy away from something being modified to have this pest resistance when ultimately it's probably better for the crop to already have the pest resistance than continuing to put down chemicals that are going to have negative impacts in more than just the square footage of that field. I can probably ramble on and on about this. I can go on a GMO rant, but that's not what this is about. This is about how pesticides are ultimately harming the soil, the organisms within the soil as well, and as a result, harming the literal base of ecosystems. And we don't really have a clear understanding of what the implication of that is, and that's a problem. And this is just more evidence that we really need to rethink modern agriculture and rework the entire industry if we're going to have a sustainable future. But that's all I really have for you today. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, afternoon, evening, what have you. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Please leave your thoughts in that comment section down below. Keep the conversation going, and I will see you all in the next one.
Thank you again for watching this video. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and ring that bell if you would like to see more. And if you'd like to follow me on any of my other social medias, the links are down in the description below. Don't forget to check out thereptilegoth.com for all of my articles and blog posts. If you found any value in this video and you would like to help support the channel, please check out my Patreon page. That link is also in the description down below. And a special thanks goes out to my Diamond Dragon patron, Diane B. What you're doing is really helping me fund a dream here. I will see you guys all in the next one.